Scientists just revealed Europe's dark past hidden in Sami DNA. What if the truth about an entire people had been buried for centuries, not in a grave, but inside their own bodies? And what if the moment that truth was finally uncovered, it shattered everything historians thought they knew? Before we go any further, if stories like this make you stop and think, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss one, and share this with someone who loves history, because this one is going to stay with you. Here's where it begins. A frozen lake in northern Finland, a grave that had been sitting quietly in the earth for over 400 years. When archaeologists first found the skeleton, they were not surprised. The man buried there appeared to be Sámi, a member of one of the oldest indigenous peoples in Europe. People who had been living across the Arctic regions of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia for thousands of years. The grave looked ordinary. For decades, it was treated as ordinary. Scientists noted it, cataloged it, and moved on. Then in 2026, researchers from the University of Turku decided to look again. But this time, they were not looking at bones. They were looking at teeth, specifically at the chemical fingerprints locked inside the enamel. And what they found inside that man's teeth turned an ordinary grave into one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries in recent memory. Here is something most people do not know. As your adult teeth are forming during childhood, they absorb tiny amounts of elements from everything you eat and drink. One of those elements is strontium. And strontium is interesting because it does not behave the same way everywhere. Different regions of the Earth have different geological compositions, and those differences leave behind distinct chemical signatures. So your teeth are essentially a geological passport. They record where you spent your early years with surprising precision. When scientists ran the Kitka Man's isotopes through databases, comparing them to regions across northern Europe, something strange happened. Nothing matched. Not Finland, not Sweden, not Norway, not Russia. The signature did not fit any corner of mainland Scandinavia. The researchers widened their search. They compared the results to more distant landscapes, more unusual geologies, places with very different rock formations. And eventually, one match emerged. A volcanic island rising out of the cold North Atlantic, Iceland. Somehow, a Sami man who was buried near Lake Kitka in Finland around the year 1600 had spent meaningful years of his childhood or youth on one of the most remote islands in the world. Over 2,000 kilometers from home, across open sea and brutal terrain. He had made that journey, or been part of networks that made it possible, and then returned. And nobody knew. No written record preserved his name, his route, or his reasons. Only his teeth remembered. That discovery alone would have been enough to rewrite certain chapters of history. Because, for generations, a very specific story had been told about the Sami. That they were isolated, that they stayed close to their frozen homelands, that their world was small and self-contained. The Kitka Man proved otherwise in a single chemical signature. He was not frozen in place. He was moving through a connected world that historians had never imagined. But here's the thing. As remarkable as that discovery was, it is actually the smaller part of the story. Because when scientists turned from isotopes to DNA, from one man's teeth to the genetic record of the entire Sami population, the mystery got much bigger and much older. The Sami are not like other European peoples, not genetically. Their ancestry does not follow the same patterns seen in populations across the rest of Europe. And to understand why, you have to go back not 4 centuries, but 12,000 years. 12,000 years ago, the last ice age was ending. Glaciers that had covered enormous stretches of northern Europe for tens of thousands of years were finally retreating. As the ice pulled back, it left behind rivers, forests, and open tundra, raw landscape. And slowly, carefully, humans followed. These first pioneers were hunter-gatherers. They did not plant crops, they did not raise animals. They tracked wild reindeer across frozen ground, pulled fish from Arctic rivers, and hunted seals along coastlines that were only just becoming ice-free. They learned to read a world that most humans never had to understand, and they were remarkably successful at it. Ancient DNA recovered from their remains reveals something fascinating. These early people who colonized the far north were already a mixture of 2 distinct populations. One group had moved northward from Western Europe as the glaciers retreated. The other had pushed westward along the Arctic coastline from northeastern Europe. Where those 2 streams of humanity met, a new population took shape. Scientists call them the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. For thousands of years, they lived across what is now Norway, Sweden, and Finland. They mastered the Arctic. They built a way of life that sustained them across generations. But they were not yet the Sami. The people we now call Sami would emerge through a second, later transformation. One that had nothing to do with Western Europe. Its origins lay thousands of kilometers to the east, beyond the Ural Mountains, deep inside the vast forests and river systems of northern Asia. For a long time, researchers suspected that some Eastern genetic influence had entered the far north, but the details were blurry. When exactly did this happen? Who were these migrants? How did they arrive? Ancient DNA has now sharpened that picture. Starting roughly 300-500 years ago, communities carrying a distinctive northeastern Eurasian genetic signature began expanding westward. They moved slowly across enormous distances, following river systems and forest corridors that connected Asia to northern Europe, in ways that feel almost impossible from a modern perspective. These migrants brought something else with them: language, specifically early forms of what linguists call Uralic languages. That is the family that today includes Finnish, Estonian, Hungarian, and the various Sami languages, languages spoken from the Baltic Sea all the way into Siberia, languages that share grammar structures, root words, and patterns that could only have come from a common ancient source. The migrants were not just carrying genes, they were carrying an entirely different way of organizing sound and meaning. And when these eastern arrivals reached the far north, something important happened. They did not erase the people already living there. They did not push the ancient Scandinavian hunter-gatherers aside. Instead, over generations, the two populations mixed, slowly, unevenly, across different communities and different timelines, but persistently. The result was that people whose genetic profile became genuinely unlike any other population in Europe. You can see it clearly in the data. The paternal lineages of the Sami, passed down through the Y chromosome from father to son, increasingly reflect that eastern migration. A specific genetic marker called haplogroup N1A1 spread westward from northeastern Eurasia and became common among Sami men. But the maternal lineages, passed down through mitochondrial DNA from mother to child, tell a different story. They reflect some of Europe's oldest ancestry, lineages that trace back to Ice Age hunter-gatherers who survived the glacial maximum in refuges across southern Europe before expanding northward. The combination of both, ancient European maternal lines woven together with northeastern Eurasian paternal lines, is what makes the Sami genetically extraordinary. Neither purely European, neither purely Siberian, something that emerged between those worlds and became entirely its own. Recent ancient DNA studies published through 2026 have added even more detail to this picture. Rather than a single migration event, the genetic record shows multiple waves of interaction across northern Fennoscandia over thousands of years. By the early Iron Age, the distinctive genetic signature recognizable in modern Sami, populations had largely stabilized. What followed was centuries of relative isolation, not because the Sami never traveled. The Kitka Man proved they did, but because the Arctic itself acted as a barrier, keeping large-scale outside migrations away in a way that simply did not happen further south. Okay, here's a quick challenge for you. If you have made it this far, you already care more about this story than most people ever will. So prove it. Drop a comment below with the word Sapmi. Just that word. It tells me you are actually here, actually listening, and actually thinking. And it helps this video reach more people who deserve to hear this story too. Most of Europe was reshaped again and again over the past several thousand years. Farmers arrived from Anatolia around 9,000 years ago and transformed the continent. Then, steppe pastoralists swept across from the east around 5,000 years ago and shifted the genetic landscape again. Romans, Germanic tribes, Slavs, Vikings, and countless smaller movements all left their marks. Population after population replaced, absorbed, or transformed whoever came before. Northern Fennoscandia largely avoided that pattern. The harshness of the environment made large-scale invasion impractical. The distances were enormous. The winters were brutal. Outsiders who entered Sami territory without the knowledge, built up over thousands of years of Arctic adaptation, rarely survived long enough to change the population. So instead of being a crossroads, the far north became a refuge, a place where older genetic and cultural patterns persisted long after they had disappeared everywhere else. That isolation left a visible mark in the genetics. Compared with most European populations, the Sami show unusually low genetic diversity. In genetics, this is a signature of what researchers call a population bottleneck, a period when a relatively small group gave rise to most future generations. It is not a sign of weakness. It is a record of continuity. The same families, the same communities, generation after generation, holding on in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on the planet. And the knowledge required to survive that landscape is genuinely breathtaking. The Sami developed an understanding of their environment that has no parallel in most of the world. You may have heard the claim that Sami languages have hundreds of words for snow. That is often overstated, but the underlying reality it points to is real. Different Sami languages contain an extraordinarily rich vocabulary for describing snow conditions, ice thickness, wind patterns, and reindeer behavior, not as poetic flourishes, as survival tools. Knowing the difference between types of snow was not a curiosity. It determined whether a journey was safe, whether a reindeer herd could dig through the crust to reach the lichen underneath, whether your family would make it through another winter. That same precision ran through every part of their material culture. The gakti, the traditional Sami garment with its vivid colors and intricate patterns, was not simply clothing. It was communication. To another Sami person, the specific colors, stitching, and decorative elements of a gakti revealed where you came from. Which community? Which family? In a world before written records and government identification, the clothing itself carried an entire social identity. Their communities were organized through flexible groupings called saidas. These were not rigid kingdoms with fixed borders and centralized rulers. They were cooperative units that shared access to fishing grounds, hunting territories, and the migration routes that reindeer followed across the seasons. Decisions were made together because, in an Arctic environment, survival demanded cooperation more than it demanded hierarchy. Their spiritual life was equally sophisticated. The Sami understood themselves as participants in the natural world rather than controllers of it. Mountains, rivers, lakes, and unusual rock formations were not simply geography. They were places where the spiritual world and the physical world met. Sacred sites, known as siedi, received offerings. Religious specialists known as noidi used beautifully crafted ceremonial drums to enter altered states of consciousness, seeking guidance for the community on matters of healing, hunting, and survival. These drums were more than instruments. They were visual encyclopedias. The symbols painted or carved onto their surfaces mapped relationships between people, animals, ancestors, spirits, and the forces of the natural world. They were, in a very real sense, a complete Sami cosmology made physical. For thousands of years, this world persisted, adapted, endured. The Arctic protected it. But eventually, that protection was not enough. By the Middle Ages, kingdoms in Norway, Sweden, and Russia had begun looking northward with entirely new intentions. For them, the Arctic was not empty wilderness. It was a source of extraordinary wealth. Valuable furs, rich fisheries, vast forests, mineral resources. And the people already living there presented a problem for anyone who wanted to claim those resources without complication. The solution was not military conquest, at least not in the traditional sense. There were no great battles, no armies marching over the tundra. Instead, colonization arrived through paperwork. Officials appeared, carrying ledgers and legal instruments. They drew borders on maps made in southern capitals, borders that cut directly through seasonal migration routes that Sami families had followed for generations without ever crossing a political boundary, because those boundaries had not existed. Suddenly, families found themselves divided between competing kingdoms. In some areas, Sami communities were taxed by more than one crown simultaneously. The same people, the same land, claimed by multiple governments at once. Slowly, the space in which the Sami had lived freely for thousands of years was being carved into someone else's territory. But that was still not the worst of it. By the 17th century, Christian missionaries arrived in Sapmi with a specific mission: convert the Sami and erase the spiritual foundations that made Sami culture coherent. The Noidi were targeted first. Their drums were confiscated. Ceremonies that had been practiced for centuries were outlawed. Traditional beliefs that guided Arctic life across generations were labeled witchcraft. Practitioners who refused to abandon them faced imprisonment. Some faced execution. The destruction of the drums carried a weight beyond their physical loss. Each drum was unique. Each was a record of a specific community's spiritual geography, its ancestors, its understanding of the world. Burning those drums was not simply destroying objects. It was an attempt to delete an entire way of understanding existence. And then came something that claimed to be science. Take a breath here, because what comes next is one of the most disturbing chapters in European history. And it is one that most people outside of Scandinavia have never heard about. If this story deserves to be told, then share it right now. Not tomorrow. Right now. Post it somewhere. Send it to someone. Because silence is how this chapter stayed hidden for so long. And you have the power to change that. By the late 19th century, a poisonous idea had spread across European academia. The idea that human beings could be sorted into racial hierarchies based on physical measurements, that some peoples were biologically superior, others inferior, and that science could prove it. The Sami became a primary target. Researchers traveled into Sapmi with cameras, measuring tapes and notebooks. They photographed Sami men, women, and children. They measured skull dimensions, facial angles, and body proportions. They cataloged everything with the language of science while pursuing conclusions that had already been decided before they arrived. The goal was not discovery. It was justification. If the Sami could be presented as primitive, as a lesser people, it became easier for governments to take their land, restrict their movements, and deny them the same rights enjoyed by Norwegian, Swedish, or Finnish citizens. None of this was real science. It was ideology dressed in laboratory language, but it was treated as legitimate scholarship for decades, and it caused real, lasting damage. Researchers also began excavating ancient Sami burial sites. Hundreds of ancestral remains were removed from graves and transported to universities and museums in Oslo, Stockholm, and Helsinki. There they sat for decades, labeled and stored as objects of scientific curiosity. Human beings, reduced to data points. Ancestors separated from the descendants who might have mourned them. Only in recent years have serious efforts begun to return those remains to Sami communities. The process has been slow and painful. Some remains are still waiting. But of all the assaults on Sami identity across centuries of colonization, perhaps none caused more lasting damage than what happened to the children. Through much of the 20th century, thousands of Sami children were removed from their families and sent to state-run boarding schools. These institutions operated across Norway, Sweden, and Finland with a clear purpose: assimilation. The children who arrived speaking Sami were punished for using their language, their traditional clothing was taken away or mocked, the customs, stories, and knowledge their grandparents had spent lifetimes preserving were treated as embarrassing, primitive things to be discarded. Many of these children grew up and returned home to find that the distance between them and their own culture had become unbridgeable. They could not speak fluently with their grandparents. They had lost access to the oral traditions, the place names, the ecological knowledge, the songs, and the stories that had been passed down across centuries. Within a single generation, a vast wealth of accumulated human knowledge was severed. It was one of the most effective cultural erasure campaigns ever conducted against an indigenous people in Europe. And it happened within living memory. Yet the Sami survived, not as a museum piece, not as a frozen relic of the past. They survived because they adapted, fought back, and refused to disappear even when every institution around them insisted they should. Today, Sami languages are being revived and taught in schools. The yoic, a traditional form of vocal music that is deeply personal and unlike almost anything else in the world, has experienced a powerful revival. Ancient ceremonies are being studied, practiced, and passed to younger generations. Sami political organizations are fighting for land rights, resource rights, and formal recognition across 4 countries. The conversation is far from over, but it is louder and more visible than it has been in centuries. And then science offered something unexpected. The 2026 University of Turku study did more than identify one man's surprising biography. It changed the framing of an entire people. For generations, the dominant narrative about the Sami was built on assumptions of isolation and limitation. A small people in a remote place, disconnected from the larger currents of history. The Kitka Man quietly demolished that story with chemistry. A Sami man traveling between Arctic Finland and Iceland 4 centuries ago was not a curiosity. He was evidence. Evidence of maritime networks, trade routes, and human connections stretching across the North Atlantic that historians had not mapped and written sources had not preserved. Evidence that the Sami were participants in a wider northern world, not observers at the edge of it. And when you pair that discovery with what ancient DNA has revealed about the deep origins of the Sami people, a completely different portrait emerges. Not a people frozen in isolation, a people shaped by thousands of years of movement, migration, and mixing. Ancient European, hunter-gatherers, Eastern arrivals from beyond the Urals, connections reaching across Arctic seas, survival across conditions that broke civilizations far more powerful than any single culture ever facing the northern ice. The Sami genome is, in a very real sense, a record of everything that history tried to erase. Colonial maps, burned drums, stolen children, and measuring tapes wielded by men who had no business calling themselves scientists. None of it eliminated the genetic signature of an Arctic people whose ancestors survived the end of the last ice age and built one of the most sophisticated relationships with a natural environment that humanity has ever produced. We are close to the end now, and I want to make sure this lands the way it should. Because this is not just a story about the Sami. It is a story about what happens when history tries to silence people, and what happens when science is finally honest enough to listen. There's a line worth holding on to here. Genes do not create culture. DNA cannot explain music, language, spirituality, or the particular way a community understands the world. But genetics can recover journeys that written history forgot. It can find the evidence of where people went when no one was writing it down. It can confirm survival when everything suggested disappearance was inevitable. The Kitka Man's teeth preserved a journey that no document remembered. His chemical fingerprint outlasted 4 centuries of silence. And when researchers finally asked the right question, the answer changed everything. That is the lesson underneath all of this. History is never as finished as we think it is. The graves we assume are ordinary sometimes contain extraordinary things. The people we have been taught to overlook sometimes carry the most remarkable stories. And sometimes those stories have been waiting patiently inside something as small and unremarkable as a tooth, preserved across centuries, ready to be heard the moment someone finally decides to listen. The ice remembers. And thanks to the courage of Sami communities who refuse to disappear and the scientists willing to ask better questions, we are finally starting to remember too. If this story moved you, do one thing before you close this tab. Not for the algorithm, not for the channel, for the people in this story. Share it. Put it somewhere someone will see it. Because the best way to honor people who were silenced for centuries is to make sure their story is heard now. Thank you for watching. And I will see you in the next one.